The horse wasn't supposed to matter. That was the first thing folks whispered when they saw him tied near the far end of the dusty auction yard, head low, ribs showing through a dull, battered coat. Buyers walked right past him without slowing, some shaking their heads, others muttering that he wasn't worth a single coin. Even the auction workers didn't bother brushing the dirt off his back. They had bigger, stronger animals to parade on the front rails, the ones that drew crowds and earned loud bids. This horse was the kind they pushed to the end of the list, hoping someone would take him just so they wouldn't have to decide what would happen if no one stepped forward. But the young man standing near the back rail wasn't looking at the prized horses. His eyes drifted toward the unwanted one every few seconds, as if pulled by something he couldn't quite explain. He hadn't come to the auction to buy a horse at all. His plan had been simple: pick up supplies, head home, save whatever money he had left. But every time he tried to turn away, he caught the horse lifting its head just a little, showing a pair of dark, watchful eyes that held a story no one else cared to read. The wind kicked up dust as the announcer rattled through the list, moving closer to the end. People were already leaving, their hats pulled low, voices carrying toward their wagons and saddled horses. Only a few remained. It was late enough in the day that most of the excitement had already passed. But the young man stayed where he was, leaning against the rail, arms crossed. The closer they got to the final horse, the harder his heart beat, as if something inside him knew this moment wasn't accidental. When they finally dragged the unwanted horse into the ring, the crowd barely reacted. Someone chuckled under their breath. Another man shook his head and said he'd seen healthier fence posts. The announcer didn't bother making a long speech. He simply called out the number and waited. Silence settled over the yard. A few people shifted on their feet. The horse flicked his ears and lowered his head again, as if he already knew what the silence meant. The young man didn't think. His hand lifted before he knew he was doing it. A couple of heads turned his way. Even the announcer looked surprised to see a bid. But he accepted it quickly, probably relieved that someone was willing to take the burden off their hands. No one else challenged the offer. Within seconds, the deal was made. The horse was his. He walked into the ring to take the rope, expecting the horse to shy away or push back. Instead, the animal lifted his head and stared straight at him, as if studying him. Something about that look made his breath catch. It wasn't fear in the horse's eyes. It was something quieter, something heavier. Trust didn't seem like the right word. Neither did hope. It was more like the horse was searching for a reason to keep standing. The young man swallowed and wrapped the rope around his hand. "Let's get you home," he murmured. Though he had no idea what home would mean for the horse or what this decision would cost him, he wasn't a wealthy man, far from it. He barely had enough feed for the animals he already cared for, and taking on another was the kind of choice people would call foolish. But he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would have been worse. He led the horse out of the ring, ignoring the looks and the quiet comments drifting behind him. Some said he wasted his money. Others joked he must have felt sorry for the thing. A few simply shrugged, figuring it wasn't their problem. The horse stumbled once as they crossed the yard, his legs thin and unsteady. The young man steadied him with a hand pressed gently against his shoulder. That small touch made something shift inside him. The horse leaned into the pressure like he hadn't felt a kind hand in a long time. When they reached the far end of the yard, the young man paused to look the horse over more closely. Up close, the marks on his coat told a harsher story: old scars, fresh scrapes, a deep bruise near his ribs. Whoever had owned him before hadn't cared for him, that much was clear. But there was also strength beneath the roughness, a quiet power waiting beneath the surface. "You've been through something," the young man whispered, brushing a loose strand of mane away from the horse's eye. The horse blinked slowly, almost as if answering him. He led him toward the narrow road where his wagon waited. Each step the horse took seemed uncertain, but he didn't resist. Instead, he followed with a calmness that surprised the young man. As they walked, he couldn't help wondering what the horse had endured and why someone would give up on him. He wondered if anyone else had ever seen the spark that now flickered in those tired eyes. People said auctions were full of surprises, but this felt different. This felt like the start of something bigger than either of them understood. The horse's past hung between them like a shadow, heavy and silent, waiting to reveal itself. And the young man sensed that whatever had happened before would play a part in what happened next. He reached the wagon and hesitated. There was no easy way to lift the horse into the trailer, and he wasn't sure the animal had the strength to climb inside on his own. But before he could figure out a plan, the horse stepped forward and nudged his arm gently, as if urging him not to worry. "You want to try?" the young man asked softly. The horse shifted his weight, lifted a hoof, then stopped. His breath came shallow, and for a moment the young man thought he might collapse. He gripped the rope, ready to catch him, but the horse steadied himself again. Behind them, a distant voice called out something he couldn't make out, but he ignored it. All his attention was on the horse. Slowly, carefully, the animal took another step toward the wagon, and another. The young man stood beside him, guiding but not pushing. When the horse finally reached the ramp, he paused, trembling as if fighting a battle only he understood. "Easy," the young man whispered. "I'm right here." The horse lowered his head and breathed out, a long, shaky breath that carried more weight than the young man expected. Then he lifted his hoof and placed it on the ramp. A sudden shout echoed from behind them, sharp and unexpected. The horse flinched, muscles tensing. The young man turned quickly, squinting toward the voice, but he couldn't see who it was through the thin cloud of dust drifting across the yard. The shout came again, louder this time. Something about it made the young man's stomach tighten. He felt the horse press closer to him, trembling harder now. Whoever was calling out wasn't just trying to get attention. The tone held something urgent, something that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. He reached for the horse's shoulder, ready to calm him, but before he could speak, the horse jerked his head toward the noise with a look that chilled the young man to the bone. The animal's ears pinned back and his eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. The young man followed the horse's gaze and saw a figure moving through the yard, pushing past the last few people near the closing pens. The figure walked with purpose, each step faster than the last. The horse let out a low, pained sound the young man had never heard from an animal before. Something caught between a warning and a memory. And in that moment, the young man realized the horse knew exactly who was coming. The young man stayed by the horse long after the yard had emptied. The fading light stretched shadows across the ground, and the steady sounds of the evening carried across the property. Crickets had begun their nightly chorus. A few workers left the barns, walking with the tired steps of people who had already worked a long day. None of them paid much attention to the thin horse standing near the fence, or the young man who kept giving him those careful glances. It was as if the world around them moved on as usual, while the two of them stayed in a moment that felt separate from everything else. The horse stood with his head lowered, shifting his weight in a slow way that suggested he was worn down in more ways than one. His ribs showed under his dull coat. His tail hung low. When the young man took a step closer, the horse stirred as though ready to move away, but then stopped as if he no longer had the energy for fear. The young man spoke to him softly, trying to offer comfort, one quiet word after another. He did not expect a response. He just wanted the horse to hear a voice that meant no harm. He reached out carefully and touched the side of the horse's neck. The animal flinched, then stilled. It was the kind of reaction that told a story without using sound. The young man felt something tighten in his chest, and he let his hand rest there a moment longer. He had always believed that animals carried the truth of their past in their bodies, the same way people carried the truth in their eyes. Across the yard, one of the auction hands called out that the office was closing. The young man looked toward the small building, then back at the horse. He had not made this choice in a rush. Even when he raised his hand during the bidding, he knew people thought he was wasting his money. But he felt something while watching that thin horse be led into the ring earlier. It was not pity, it was not some sudden wish to do something noble. It was more simple than that. He saw a horse who had been given up on, and something inside him refused to do the same. He walked the horse toward his old wagon near the edge of the road. He moved slowly so the animal did not strain himself, keeping the lead rope loose so the horse did not feel pushed. The wagon was not much to look at. The paint had faded and the wheels creaked more than they used to. But it was his, and he had fixed it up enough times to trust it would get him back home. He had cleared space for the horse before heading to the auction, even though he had told no one of his plans. Most folks he worked with would have tried to talk him out of it. They would have said the horse was too thin, too worn, too much trouble for a young man who barely had enough to keep himself going. He had heard that sort of talk more than once in his life, and he did not need to hear it again. The horse stepped onto the wagon with shaky legs. The young man tied the rope loosely so the animal had room to steady himself. When he climbed up onto the seat and took the reins, he glanced back. The horse looked at him with tired eyes that held something faint underneath the exhaustion. It was almost like a question. The young man tapped the reins gently, and the wagon rolled forward. The road stretched long and empty ahead of them, lined with tall grasses and fences that seemed to go on for miles. The sun had dipped lower, staining the sky with warm orange and gold. The young man breathed in the cool evening air and let the rhythm of the wagon calm his thoughts. He wondered what the horse had been through. Animals did not end up at auctions like this without a chain of events leading them there. Sometimes it was a matter of bad luck. Other times it was a matter of someone giving up. He did not know which one it was for this horse, but he planned to find out with time. When he finally reached his small property, the moon was rising. The wooden gate creaked open as he led the horse into the yard. He kept a modest barn with a few stalls and a tack room that smelled of hay and old leather. He guided the thin horse into the nearest stall, spread out fresh hay, and filled a bucket with clean water. The horse lowered his head eagerly, drinking as if he had not been given water in a long while. The young man stepped back and watched with quiet relief. He stayed in the barn longer than necessary, making sure the horse settled down. When he finally walked back toward his cabin, he felt the night settle around him in a way that made him think of the changes that had just begun. He had taken in something fragile, something the world had overlooked. And he knew that kind of choice always came with a story that unfolded slowly. Morning came with a soft mist rolling across the fields. The young man rose from his bed and stepped outside as soon as the sun began pushing through the fog. He made his way to the barn, half expecting the horse to be lying down from weakness. When he reached the stall, the animal was standing, head lowered but alert. The young man felt a small rush of relief. He spoke to him calmly, brushing his coat with long strokes. As the dirt loosened and the dull fur began to show a bit of color, the young man noticed marks and scars he had not seen last night. He paused, letting his hand rest there as he studied the lines across the horse's side. They were old marks. They told of hard work, long days, and perhaps not much care in return. The horse shifted slightly, and the young man stepped back so he would not crowd him. He wanted to help, but he knew trust had to be earned slowly. After tending to the horse, he stepped outside to start his other tasks. His land was not large, but it required steady work. He fixed a fence rail, gathered supplies, and checked the fields. All the while his thoughts drifted back to the thin horse waiting in the barn. There was something about him that felt different from any animal he had brought home before. He could not explain it in clear words. It was just a sense that there was more to this horse's story than anyone at the auction had bothered to notice. By midday he saddled his old mare to ride into town for supplies. As he rode down the winding road, he found himself thinking about the reactions he might face when folks heard what he had done. People talked in town. They always had. Some would call it a foolish choice. Others might shrug and say it made no difference. But a small number, the ones who understood animals well, might see something in his decision that they respected. He did not care much either way. The only opinion that mattered belonged to the horse he had brought home. When he reached the general store, he tied the mare and walked inside. A few locals stood near the counter discussing news from nearby farms. The store owner nodded at him, and he gathered the supplies he needed without making a fuss. As he placed the items on the counter, the owner gave him a curious look. He asked if the auction had been worth the trip. The young man paused before answering, then said he brought home a horse that needed some care. The owner raised his brows but did not ask for details. Instead, he said something simple about how some animals just needed the right hands to guide them. The young man paid for his supplies and headed out. When he mounted his mare for the ride home, he felt a quiet strength building inside him. He was used to hard work and long days. He had taken on challenges before, but this one felt different. It was not about training a horse or fixing an animal's health. It was something deeper, something that pressed against his thoughts every time he looked into the tired eyes of the horse in his barn. On the ride back, he noticed a wagon coming down the road from the opposite direction. A family he recognized nodded at him politely as they passed. The young man nodded back, feeling the usual calm of open roads and gentle wind. But once the wagon disappeared in the distance, his thoughts shifted again to the new horse waiting at home. He wondered how long it would take before the horse gained some strength. He wondered how much work it would require to earn the animal's trust. He wondered what the horse had lived through and what kind of life had shaped him into the frightened creature he had seen at the auction. The sky was turning a deeper shade of blue as he reached his property once again. He put away the supplies, checked on his mare, then walked to the barn. As he stepped inside, he heard the faint shuffling of hooves. The thin horse looked toward him in a way that felt slightly more alert than the night before. It was a small change, but he noticed it instantly. The young man approached slowly, speaking in that same calm tone he had used since the auction. He placed fresh hay in the stall, then checked the water bucket. The horse took a cautious step toward him. It was a single step, but it carried meaning. The young man stood still, giving the horse space. He felt a quiet sense of hope building, though he kept it steady, knowing not to rush anything. The air in the barn grew still as the two of them stood in that moment. The young man lowered his hand, offering it gently. The horse hesitated. His ears twitched. His breathing shifted. The young man waited, his hand steady, his voice soft. The horse leaned in ever so slightly, as if trying to decide whether to move closer or pull away. The young man could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the horse's past meeting the uncertain promise of whatever lay ahead. Before the moment could unfold any further, a sharp sound echoed from outside the barn. It startled the horse, and he jerked back with sudden fear. The young man turned toward the noise, his heart picking up. He could not see what caused it. Only the quiet wind pushed through the yard. And in that single instant, he knew something had shifted around them in a way he did not yet understand. The young man stepped toward the barn door, listening hard for the sound he had heard. It had come from somewhere near the gate, sharp enough to make the thin horse jump back as though danger had returned to him all at once. The wind moved through the dry grass outside, brushing the fence rails in a steady rhythm. Nothing else seemed out of place, yet the tension in the air refused to ease. He stepped outside and scanned the yard. The last of the evening light washed everything in a pale glow. His small cabin sat quiet near the edge of the field. The gate stood closed, and the road beyond it was empty. Still, something felt off. It was as if the land held its breath for a moment. The young man waited, trying to catch any sign of movement, any shape in the distance, but nothing came forward. He returned to the barn, and the thin horse stood pressed against the far wall as if preparing for trouble. The young man spoke gently again, keeping his steps slow, giving the horse time to steady himself. It took a long minute before the animal stopped shaking. The young man placed a hand near the stall door, not reaching out fully, only letting the horse see that he meant no harm. This time, the horse did not step away. He only watched, his ears turning slightly forward with uncertain curiosity. As the night settled over the land, the young man lingered near the stall. He thought about the sudden noise. It might have been nothing. A loose fence rail, a wandering animal? But something about it stayed in his mind. He did not want anything unexpected near the horse, not yet. Not while the animal was still trying to understand that this place was safe. He eventually closed the barn doors and made his way back to the cabin. Before going inside, he glanced once more at the gate. The road looked as empty as it had earlier. But he still felt that weight inside his chest, the kind that came when a man sensed a story building around him without knowing its shape. The next morning he returned to the barn before the sun fully rose. Mist hung low over the fields and the air smelled of damp soil. The horse lifted his head when the young man entered. There was a small spark in the animal's eyes that had not been there on the first night. A sign that the layers of fear were loosening, even if only a little at a time. The young man brushed the horse's coat again, removing the dust and dried mud that hid the soft color beneath. He worked slowly, careful not to touch the more sensitive marks or scars along the horse's sides. The horse shifted but did not withdraw. At one moment the animal leaned slightly toward the brush, almost as if welcoming the care. Later that morning the young man saddled his old mare and rode out to the neighboring property. He needed to ask a few questions about stray animals near his land, hoping someone might have heard or seen something that explained the strange noise from the night before. The neighbor was an older man who had lived on the land for many years, known for keeping a close eye on the area. When the young man mentioned the sound, the neighbor leaned on his fence and looked down the quiet road with a thoughtful frown. He said he had not seen anything out of the ordinary, but he mentioned a wagon passing by late in the afternoon the previous day. He had not recognized the people in it. Travelers, maybe, folks moving belongings. He waved it off as nothing serious, but the young man felt something tug at his thoughts. Could someone from that wagon have wandered close to his place? Maybe they were looking for something. Or someone. The young man rode back home with the uneasy feeling still turning in his stomach. When he fed the thin horse at midday, he noticed the animal raising his head suddenly at every small noise. A falling bucket in the tack room. A bird landing on the roof. The young man wondered whether the horse was simply reacting out of habit or sensing something the way animals often did long before people noticed. Through the week, the young man's routine centered around helping the horse regain strength. He offered small amounts of grain, fresh hay, and clean water. He walked the horse around the yard each morning, letting him stretch his stiff legs. The horse grew steadier with each passing day, though he still carried that wary tension in his body. One afternoon, while brushing the horse outside the barn, the young man noticed something hidden under the long hair near the horse's neck, a faint mark shaped in a way that did not look natural. It was not a wound, not something caused by an accident. It looked more like a faded brand, old and worn from time. The edges were difficult to make out, but it was enough to suggest that the horse had a past that someone might not want forgotten. The young man stepped back, staring at the mark with growing caution. He knew that brands could tie animals to owners, ranches, or even disputes. Sometimes they meant a horse had been sold or traded too many times. Sometimes they hinted at stories that people kept quiet for a reason. The thin horse turned his head slightly as if sensing the young man's shift in energy. The young man placed a calm hand on the horse's shoulder before returning him to the stall. The next day, he rode into town again, carrying a small piece of paper on which he had sketched the faint shape he had seen. He visited the general store and the feed supply shop, quietly asking if anyone recognized the design. Most people shook their heads, though one man thought it looked familiar in a way he could not place. Another man suggested checking the old livestock records at the far end of town, where older ranch brands were kept in books that hardly anyone touched anymore. The young man made his way to that small office, where the shelves held dusty binders filled with hand-drawn brands and old ownership marks. The clerk on duty pointed him toward the older volumes. The books creaked when opened. The pages were yellowed, marked with faint pencil lines and ink that had faded over time. He turned page after page, searching for anything resembling the mark on the horse. Hours passed as he scanned the records. He saw dozens of brands, some simple, some complex. A few resembled the faint shape he had traced, but none were an exact match. The clerk suggested checking the next room, where older records had been stored away in wooden crates. The young man followed the suggestion, lifting the lid of the first crate and sorting through brittle pages that threatened to tear under his fingers. Before he could find anything close, a sound came from the front of the office. Someone had stepped inside, speaking quietly with the clerk. The young man could not hear the full conversation from where he stood, but he caught fragments, enough to make him pause. The visitor was asking about horses sold at the last auction. He spoke in a firm tone, the kind that suggested he was looking for something specific. The young man kept still, running his hand along the edge of the crate. He listened harder. The visitor asked whether a thin horse with a faded mark had been brought through the auction ring. The clerk hesitated before answering, sounding uncertain. The visitor pressed again, saying he needed to know if the animal had been sold and to whom. A tightness pulled inside the young man's chest. He picked up the paper he had brought with him and quietly slipped it into his coat. He remained behind the doorway, listening. The visitor lowered his voice now, his words harder to hear. But the young man caught enough to understand that the man was not asking out of simple curiosity. His tone carried something else, something sharper. After a moment, the visitor stepped outside, and the young man waited until the clerk returned to the back room. The clerk mentioned that a stranger had been asking questions about the auction animals. The young man nodded politely, pretending not to think much of it, but inside his thoughts churned. If someone was searching for the thin horse, the question remained why. He rode home with the sun dipping low behind him. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the road. He noticed a set of wagon tracks leading down the path near his property. They were fresh, imprinted clearly into the dirt. His mare slowed as if she sensed the shift in her rider's posture. The young man followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared around a bend near the fence. He felt the tension coil inside him again, stronger now. When he reached his yard, he dismounted and walked quickly toward the barn. The thin horse stood inside his stall, unharmed but restless, pacing in small circles. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken latch, nothing disturbed. Yet something in the horse's behavior told him that someone had come close. The young man stepped into the stall and placed a steadying hand on the horse's neck. The animal leaned into the touch in a way he had not done before, as if seeking comfort, as if sensing that trouble was now circling nearby. The young man stayed there for a long moment, breathing in the warm scent of hay and dust. He knew he had stepped into something larger than buying an unwanted horse at an auction. Something from the horse's past had followed them here. Something was moving toward them now, slow but steady, carrying questions he was not prepared to answer. He looked out across his quiet land, feeling the weight of the approaching story pressing closer. And somewhere beyond the road, beyond the fences, someone else was searching, getting nearer with each passing day. The young man kept checking the road through the next few days, watching for any sign of the wagon that had passed near his property. He tried to keep his routine steady so the thin horse would feel secure, but the weight of the stranger's questions lingered in his mind. Whenever he walked the horse outside the barn, the animal kept lifting his head, ears pricked at the faintest movement. It was as if both of them sensed the same thing, that time was running short before something caught up with them. The young man spent each morning working the horse in the small pen. He kept the sessions easy, letting the animal find his balance again. The thin horse was still bony, but he moved a little smoother each day. Sometimes the young man caught glimpses of how strong the horse might one day become. There was a proud step in his stride, hidden behind weeks or months of hardship. But each time the horse seemed ready to relax, some distant noise or movement made him tense again. One afternoon, the young man rode out to visit an older woman who lived a few miles down the road. She had raised horses nearly her entire life and had seen more strays and orphaned animals than anyone in the area. He hoped she might recognize the faint mark he had sketched. When he arrived, she invited him to sit near her small porch while she studied the drawing. She squinted, turning the paper slowly in her hands. She said it resembled a brand from a ranch that used to operate farther west. The place had closed years ago after running into troubles with stolen cattle and disputes among ranch hands. Some horses from that ranch had scattered across the region. Others had been taken in by neighboring families, but a few had simply disappeared without record. She did not speak as if the mark belonged to anything dangerous, but her tone shifted slightly when she mentioned the disputes. She said it would be wise to keep the horse safe and to pay attention to anyone asking questions. The young man thanked her and rode home with her words circling his thoughts. That old ranch had been caught in enough trouble that people still whispered about it from time to time. If the horse had once belonged there, someone might still be looking for him. Maybe the animal had been taken or sold under unclear circumstances. The young man wondered if the visitor at the office was connected to that history. When he arrived back at the barn, the thin horse stood near the stall door with his head raised high, muscles tense as if listening for something outside. The young man stepped inside quickly, scanning the yard. A faint trail of hoof prints led from the fence line toward the trees. They did not belong to his mare or to the thin horse. Someone had ridden close again. He followed the tracks only far enough to see where they turned back toward the road. Whoever had come near had stayed long enough to look over the property, but not long enough to leave a clear sign of their purpose. The young man returned to the barn with the unease growing heavier inside him. That night he could not sleep. He kept hearing rustling outside, though each time he stepped onto the porch, the yard lay quiet under the moonlight. The horse shifted inside the barn, kicking lightly against the stall. The young man walked there with a lantern, speaking softly to calm the animal. The horse's eyes reflected the light, wide with the same worry that kept the young man awake. He stayed near the stall until the sky began to lighten with dawn. When he finally stepped outside, he saw fresh wagon tracks near the gate again, faint but unmistakable. Someone was circling more boldly now, no longer hiding their presence. The young man spent the morning tending to chores, though he kept his attention toward the road. He tried to push worry aside, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong by bringing the thin horse home. But fear had a way of spreading roots once it was planted. Every sound pulled his eyes in a new direction. Every shadow made him pause. That afternoon, he saddled his Mara and rode into town again, hoping for any news that might guide his next steps. When he reached the general store, a few men were gathered near the steps talking in low tones. They quieted when he approached. The store owner pulled him aside and asked if he had heard the talk about a stranger passing through, asking more questions about auction animals and missing livestock. The description matched the visitor from the office. The store owner said the man had camped not far from the edge of town and had been riding out each day, checking properties. He had not said who he worked for, only that he was looking for a horse that had disappeared before the auction. The store owner lowered his voice, saying he did not like how the man spoke about it. Something in his words sounded more like a threat than a simple search. The young man felt his heart sink. If the thin horse had been taken from somewhere before the auction, someone might be trying to claim him, even if they had lost that right. Or the horse might have been part of some larger problem the young man did not yet understand. He thanked the store owner and mounted his Murray with a heavy breath. As he rode home, clouds gathered in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. The leaves rustled in the rising wind, and the world seemed to darken even before the storm arrived. When he reached his property, he noticed something he had missed earlier. The gate was not fully closed. It hung slightly open, though he was certain he had latched it before leaving. He dismounted quickly and checked the ground. Fresh footprints pressed into the dirt near the gate, several sets. One pair looked like heavy boots, the kind worn by someone trained in working animals. The other prints were lighter, probably someone standing by the gate while the other moved ahead. The young man ran toward the barn, already calling out. The thin horse answered with a sharp, high cry, one filled with fear. The young man flung the barn doors open. The horse was safe, still inside his stall, but the door latch had been touched. Someone had tried to open it and stopped only because the young man must have returned sooner than expected. He paced the barn in frustration, hands tightening into fists before he caught himself. The horse watched every movement, stepping back, then forward again as if wanting to understand the same puzzle. The young man knew he needed to protect the horse, but he also needed to uncover the truth behind the stranger's pursuit. That evening he walked out to the far edge of his property where the tracks led into the trees. The air was colder now, carrying the smell of the approaching storm. He followed the path until he reached a small clearing. There, at the base of an old oak, he found ashes from a recent fire. Someone had camped there, close enough to watch the barn but far enough to remain hidden. Pieces of cloth and scraps of rope lay scattered near the ashes, a tin cup, a torn bit of paper. He lifted the paper carefully. It held a rough sketch of a horse, thin and bony, with a faint brand drawn near the neck. The sketch looked almost identical to the animal in his barn. His stomach tightened. The person camping here had been watching for more than a day or two. They had likely followed the horse from the auction and traced him all the way to the young man's land. As he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, he heard twigs snap behind him. He turned quickly, but the clearing remained empty. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the warning in its sound. Whoever had been here was close, maybe still watching. He hurried back toward the barn, moving faster as the wind picked up and the sky grew darker. When he reached the yard, the first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and cold. He checked the barn doors again, making sure the latch held firm. Inside, the thin horse paced with restless movements, lifting his head at every rumble of thunder. The young man stayed beside him for a long time, waiting for the storm to pass. He stroked the horse's neck and whispered steady words to calm him. Outside, rain hammered the roof and lightning lit the sky in flashes. Each clap of thunder made the horse jump, and the young man's heartbeat climbed with every sound. The storm raged through the night, and when it finally eased, the land fell into a quiet so deep it felt unsettling. The young man stepped outside and looked toward the trees. The clearing was hidden in darkness, but he felt certain someone was waiting there, planning the next move. He knew the conflict was coming closer, circling like a storm that refused to drift away. Whatever had been hidden in the horse's past was about to rise again. And when it did, it would reach his doorstep with full force. The young man stood in the yard with the wind brushing past him, feeling the pressure building around him from every side. The truth was closing in, step by step, and he could not stop it now. The only question left was how far the stranger would go to take back the horse whose story was still unfolding in the silent dark. The young man hardly slept after the storm. Dawn crept in slowly, painting the sky with a pale light that felt softer than usual. He stepped out to check the yard, expecting to see more tracks or signs of someone waiting in the distance, but the ground was washed clean from the heavy rain. Every footprint had blurred into the mud, leaving nothing to follow. For the first time in days, the world stood still around his small property. It was quiet in a way that carried both relief and uncertainty. He walked toward the barn, half expecting the thin horse to be pacing again. Instead, the animal stood calmly in the cool morning light, as if the storm had drained the fear out of him. The young man approached slowly, resting a hand on the horse's neck. The animal breathed steady and deep, showing a level of trust that had taken weeks to build. The young man took it as a sign that whatever danger had been circling might be close to revealing itself. Later that morning he saddled his Murray and rode along the outskirts of town. He hoped someone had seen the stranger or heard news that could explain the sudden disappearance of the threats. When he reached the general store, several townsfolk gathered around him, talking about the storm's damage. The store owner pulled him aside and said the stranger had been seen riding out of town toward the hills right before the storm hit. No one knew if he had left for good or if he had simply moved farther away. The young man felt torn. He wanted answers, but he also knew chasing trouble into the hills could lead to more danger than he was prepared for. He thanked the store owner and began the ride home, feeling the weight of the past days settle into something quieter, though not fully resolved. When he returned to his property, he found an old wagon standing near the gate. It leaned to one side, the wheels muddy from travel. An older man in worn clothes stepped forward, raising a hand in greeting. He looked tired but sincere, with eyes that carried years of hard work. The young man stayed cautious, unsure whether this visitor was connected to the stranger. The older man explained that he had owned a small piece of land near the old ranch that had fallen apart years ago. He said he used to help with the horses there. When the ranch collapsed, many animals were moved, stolen, or sold in secret. The thin horse had once belonged to a worker who treated him well, but that worker had been forced off the ranch after refusing to take part in the dishonest dealings. Before leaving, the worker had freed the horse, letting him escape rather than letting him fall into the wrong hands. The older man said he had recognized the horse from descriptions given by that worker. After hearing that a similar horse had appeared at the auction, he set out to find where the animal ended up. He wanted to make sure the horse had not fallen back into the wrong hands. The stranger who had been asking questions was working for people tied to the old ranch disputes. They believed the thin horse carried value not because of money, but because he had once been part of a larger scheme that had never been resolved. The young man listened silently, letting the truth settle. The older man told him that the stranger had left town because he realized the storm would wash away any tracks he had been following. But he warned that if the stranger believed the horse could help him settle old debts, he might return. The young man asked the older man what he wanted. The older man smiled and said he did not want to take the horse away. He only wanted to see that the animal was safe and cared for. He said the horse had endured enough. If he had finally found someone kind and patient, then that was the best place for him to stay. The young man felt a quiet sense of gratitude. He led the older man to the barn, and the horse lifted his head with a calm expression the moment they approached. The older man studied the animal with a soft look, recognizing the same spirit that had once drawn someone else to save the horse from a troubled fate. He placed a gentle hand on the horse's shoulder and whispered something under his breath that sounded like a farewell. When the older man stepped away, he told the young man that the horse had always been loyal to those who treated him with respect. He said the horse would thrive in a calm home, one free from the threats of old conflicts. He pointed out that the young man had already given the animal a second chance. With a small nod, he climbed back onto his wagon and left down the long road, turning only once to wave. The young man stood there for a long moment, considering everything he had learned. The thin horse did not belong to the past anymore. He was part of a new life now, safe from the mess that had followed him from the old ranch. The young man could not stop the stranger from returning, but he could make sure the horse had a home where trust and patience shaped his days instead of fear. In the weeks that followed, the property fell into a steady rhythm again. The young man worked the fields, tended the barn, and slowly built the horse's strength. The animal gained weight, his coat grew brighter, and his spirit seemed to lift. Townsfolk began noticing the change. Some would pass by and say the horse looked like a different animal compared to the one from the auction. Word spread that the young man had saved a horse nobody else wanted, and people admired the quiet dedication he showed. The stranger never returned. Whether he had given up or been forced to leave the region after the storm was something no one could answer. As time passed, the danger began to feel like a shadow fading behind a hill, still present in memory, but no longer shaping each day. The young man sometimes thought about how close he had come to losing the horse back when the barn door latch had been disturbed. He still checked the gate each night and kept the barn secured, but his fear had eased into something more watchful than anxious. He knew that life often brought challenges without warning, but he also knew that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it was quiet and steady, like the way he had showed up day after day to help a frightened, thin horse learn to trust again. As the seasons changed, the horse grew strong enough to carry a saddle without wavering. The young man chose a bright morning to try riding him for the first time. He moved slow, giving the horse room to understand each step. The animal accepted the weight with a calm breath, walking forward with a steady pace. It felt like a small miracle, the kind that sneaks up on you after months of patience. They rode across the field with the sun warming their backs. The young man felt a quiet pride swelling inside him. He had bought an unwanted horse at an auction without realizing how deep the story went. He had stepped into a trail filled with hidden dangers, old grudges, and secrets that stretched far beyond his small home. But through all of it, he had chosen loyalty and kindness over fear. The thin horse, once overlooked and shaken, had become a symbol of second chances, hope, and healing. People in town would later say that the young man and the horse became something of a reminder that the past does not have to decide the future, that with patience and understanding, even the most uncertain beginnings could lead to something good. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, the young man stood by the fence watching the horse graze in the open pasture. The wind was calm, carrying nothing but the soft rustle of grass. There was no stranger on the road. No eerie footprints by the gate. No storm clouds building on the horizon. Only a sense of peace that felt earned. He realized then that the story he had stepped into was not about danger at all. It was about what it meant to care for something fragile until it grew strong again. It was about how an unwanted horse had brought unexpected meaning into his life, teaching him patience, courage, and quiet strength. He leaned on the fence and watched the horse lift his head toward him, calm and trusting. The journey that had begun with fear and uncertainty had settled into something steady and full of hope. It was not a loud ending or a dramatic one. It was simply real, shaped by the understanding that healing comes with time, and that kindness can change everything. And with that thought, the young man stepped into the pasture, calling gently to the horse who now knew he was finally home.